The president has been impeached.
Article 1 is adopted.
But what standard did each member of the House use in arriving at their decision to vote yay or nay? In criminal cases, we have the concept of burden of proof. That's a measurement of the level of confidence that we have in order to either charge someone with a crime or ultimately convict them. To simply charge someone with a crime or indict them, you need at least probable cause. That's more likely than not that a crime was committed. It's essentially 51%. However, in order to convict at trial, the burden of proof rises dramatically. The government has to prove each and every element of a crime beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a much higher burden than simply preponderance of the evidence, or more likely than not. Impeachment cases are often compared to criminal cases. The House votes to impeach, that's like an indictment, and the Senate tries and possibly convicts the president, and that's like a conviction at trial. But the text of the Constitution gives us no explicit standard or burden of proof to apply when accusing the president in the House or convicting him at the Senate. So when members of the House voted on impeachment, what standard or burden of proof were they supposed to apply? The Constitution doesn't tell them. A conviction requires a two-thirds vote of the Senate, but that two-thirds is really just about a head count. It doesn't have anything to do with the burden of proof that each individual senator should apply. And again, the Constitution gives senators no guidance on what standard or burden of proof they should apply in reaching a decision. If an impeachment trial in the Senate is supposed to be like a criminal trial, then maybe senators should apply the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. If so, that means they must vote to acquit if they don't believe the House managers who prosecute the case have proven each and every element of their case beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a very high standard. But the reason we have this beyond a reasonable doubt standard in criminal cases is because we might take away a defendant's freedom, their liberty, one of the most important interests under our Constitution. On the other hand, just taking away somebody's job,
you're fired.
In an impeachment case, maybe we don't need the same burden of proof. Ultimately, in both the House and the Senate, the burden of proof exists in individuals' own minds. They apply whatever standard they personally see fit. After all, no judge is telling them to do otherwise, as they would with a jury. Maybe that's what the framers intended. We elect members of Congress for their judgment, so we leave it to them to decide their own individual standards.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.